Hi, Keith here with Rebel Civics on Unsafe Space. Today we have a guest, Louis Marinelli, joins us to talk about national divorce and the recently lost movement they've named CalExit 3.0. The movement proposes splitting California into two along ideological lines by holding secession referendums at the county level. The politically left majority counties would leave these United States, forming an independent, sovereign country operating under progressive ideologies. They'll have a 3-to-1 majority politically left-leaning voters based on the current county makeup. The rest of the counties of the current state of California would remain in the U.S., becoming a swing state with about an even mix of politically left, right, and independent voters. The CalExit 3.0 philosophy is classic liberalism in contrast to neoliberalism, values free market principles, civil liberties, the rule of law, and individual autonomy in an environment of free speech and limited government. So, Louis, thanks for coming on Rebel Civics.
Well, thanks for having me. You did a perfect introduction and summary of the campaign. I'm not sure what else I have to say about it.
Oh, I got a lot of questions. So, first, I think I'd like to just get the elephant out of the room. This is my second or third show I've done on secession, but the elephant in this room, that just clear this out, like, would you just give a brief summary of why a state or part of a state can leave the United States and form their own country, both morally and following the U.S. Constitution? Your view of that.
Well, sure. Our campaign at its root is based on the ideas of the freedom of association and some of the ideas of the Enlightenment and the principles that are enshrined into the Declaration of Independence. And so with that background and that philosophical root, we take the position that a state has the right to secede from the Union based on the fact that the people of that state, if they hold a fair and free election or a referendum to do so, ought to be able to determine their own futures. It's self-determination. We believe that just because, for example, in the example of California in the 1850s, a small population of American settlers voted to have California join the Union, doesn't mean that 40 million Californians now, hundreds of years later, still have to abide by that decision. And so we want to put it up to a vote in California to have California give California the choice to either stay in the Union or secede from it. But the newest iteration of our campaign is also incorporating the idea of national divorce. And so what we see is that California is, like the rest of the country, is very politically diverse. A lot of people think that California is a liberal left blue state through and through, but that's not the case. That's mostly the truth about the coastal counties and a number of counties around San Francisco and the Bay Area. And so what we're going to do is incorporate both the ideas of secession and national divorce. And we're going to have 22 counties on the coast and in the Bay Area secede from California and from the United States. And we're going to allow the remaining counties to be the state of California in the United States. And we think it's going to work. We think it's going to be a popular idea because of the polarization in the country and the polarization in California. And I think that there are a lot of people in California, particularly on the left, who would love to have a chance to build basically a progressive utopia on the coast without having to have, the Trump voters in the north or in the inland counties, the Republicans in the northern and inland counties. That's kind of stand in the way of doing that. So with all of these considerations, we take the position that the new CalExit campaign to divide the state based on its ideological lines and then have one of those secede from the Union will do two things: save California and save America.
And there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits that to a member of the Union. It's not a perpetual union.
Well, the Constitution doesn't say anything about secession at all. So it does say that the powers that are not delegated to the federal government by the people are reserved to the people. And so the Constitution does not delegate the power to regulate or prohibit or even allow secession at the federal level. So therefore, we can erase or remove the idea that there's a congressional act that needs to take place, because the government doesn't have that delegated power to it. And so what we know is that the Constitution delegates a limited and specific number of enumerated powers to the federal government, and in that list does not contain anything to do with allowing or prohibiting secession. And so therefore, that power is reserved, per the Constitution, to the people and to the states. So we're going to handle this at the state level.
Yeah, so that's a great summary. So that just the you hear the common argument that it's unconstitutional or it's traitor or those names thrown out, but that none of that's true. The way
now there is a precedent. There is a precedent on the issue. The Supreme Court kind of chimed in on the issue after the Civil War with Texas versus White. But again, there's a big misconception out there when the media talks about Texas versus White. They say that the Supreme Court, ruled that secession is unconstitutional. But that's not the case. If you read the actual text of the ruling, the Supreme Court decided that a state cannot secede unilaterally, but it can secede with the consent of the other states or by revolution. And so it specifically said that a state can secede by consent of the other states. It didn't say with the consent of Congress. It didn't say by passage of a constitutional amendment, which some people like to pull out of thin air. The Supreme Court in the 1860s, when this ruling was issued, was well aware of the institution of Congress. They could have written by the consent of Congress. They were well aware of the amendment process. They could have written through an amendment to the Constitution. They didn't. They said by the consent of the states. And so now, at this point in time in history, we have 50 states, and we are going to take the position that consent of the states can be met by getting 25, well, if you take California out of the equation, 26 total state legislatures to approve a kind of a resolution granting California to secede from the Union, or in the case of CalExit 3.0, the permission of these 22 counties of California to secede from the Union.
And the concept of going to the other states is that as a practical matter to follow what the Supreme Court has said to make it easier? Because principle wise, as you said earlier, because it's not banned in the Constitution that a state can leave. You don't need to get permission from the other states constitutionally. Disregarding what the opinion of the Supreme Court, disregarding the
doesn't provide any kind of pathway for this to happen at all. So it doesn't prohibit it. It doesn't provide a pathway for it to happen. So the only thing we have really to rely on is the Supreme Court case as the precedent. However, there's a problem with that. The problem being that it's, when was it, a couple hundred years ago? And that was the law at the time when they made that ruling. But we have a different country now. As we've seen, for example, Roe v. Wade was recently overturned. That was a major landmark decision that when they overturned Roe v. Wade, they overturned other major Supreme Court decisions in history. That's why we have, for example, integrated schools. That's why we have the women's right to vote and so on and so forth. And so the fact that because the Supreme Court ruled, I forget the actual date, but it was after the Civil War, that state can't secede except by revolution or through the consent of the states, doesn't mean that that's set in stone forever. And as soon as this issue comes before the Supreme Court again, we may very well get a different interpretation of what it means to be a state in the Union. And hopefully we'll get an interpretation that supports the right of the people to free association with the Union if they so choose.
I just checked where I talked. This was 1868. The case name is Texas v. White. So the problem with using that opinion is, and I've pointed out this before, and I'm going to push back on you slightly. So one is like, I never use the word rule because courts don't rule. They offer opinion, majority and dissenting. So the majority opinion was written by a justice that was appointed by President Lincoln right after the end of the War for Southern Independence. So the political climate there was such that the justices had to do what they did. My reading of that, they did the best they could to for their political agenda, the desired political agenda, which was to make sure that the winner of the war was right for the history books, right? That's the number one thing. That's the number one job of the court at that time. And they sort of finagled it. If you read it, you can sort of claim it said that works, but in general, I don't use a Supreme Court opinion as an argument to say something's constitutional, because they're wrong often, maybe as much as they're right. I don't know.
Yeah,
So
and
I have an
that's
opinion on
all
that
the things,
too,
so.
and I've read the Constitution, so they were wrong there. But anyway, because there's nothing in the Constitution that bans a state from leaving, a state can leave. The more interesting thing with the CalExit 3 is that to split the state up, one part's leaving, the other part's staying. So that's kind of the elephant I wanted to start with. Like, of course you can do this. As a practical matter, I kind of like the idea of getting other states to agree. And if you say 22, whatever number you want to use, like I said, I don't care that much about that. If you can't get 22, come back on and we'll talk about what to do next. Because that's not actually a limit.
I think it would have to be a majority in order to say you have consent. It didn't say unanimous consent, so it doesn't have to be all 50 states. It simply said by consent. And so I would say, my opinion is, of course, it's just my opinion, if you have 50 people in a room and 51 of them, 51%, or not 51, but 26 of them say yes to something, I think you've got the consent of the people in the room to do something. Mm-hmm. And so if you use that analogy to talk about the 50 states, if you get 26 states to say we grant California permission to secede from the Union, I think you've met the threshold of consent of the states.
Yeah, for how you do, that's like in the process of a citizen referendum. Yeah, I would agree with that. How does a society determine its form of government? Following the principle of the Declaration of Independence, which makes it very clear that the people have the authority, the right to determine their own form of government, and they have the right to alter or abolish any government that's not serving them. That's clear. That's really what this whole union is based on. The Declaration, not the Constitution. So the principles of the Declaration, from an ethical, you look at this as the moral question, like that actually overrides anything the Supreme Court's ever said. It's that principle that matters.
And the Constitution, don't forget, was a replacement of the Articles of Confederation. So it didn't come for over a decade after that. So yeah, I definitely trace our philosophical roots back to the Declaration of Independence. Like you said, we have the right to alter and abolish a government that's destructive of its responsibility to protect our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which I think is the case in today's society. And we're going to use that political and philosophical foundation to support the right of California, or at least some of the counties of California, to secede from the United States under the principle of the freedom of association. They are a different people. They have different values, different culture, and it's incompatible, or at least exceedingly and increasingly incompatible with American culture, American politics, American ideology. And so they should, if they want to, of course, they have to agree to it, which is why I don't agree with other ideas about kicking them off the island or something to that effect. But they have to agree to it, because we're not going to be able to just, they're a part of the country. They have to themselves initiate this, and they have to support it, and they have to vote for it. And then after that happens, then they can apply for permission from the other states, and they have to get a majority of them to agree.
So, and by they, you referring to what you started talking about, the Bay Area and the coastal parts of California that are the Democrat majority, progressive left voters, overwhelmingly, statistically, right? I know there's a mix everywhere, right? So, but the majority vote there.
When we just drew those lines, not only did we choose the counties that were most heavily populated by left-wing voters, but we also looked at what is the trend in those counties. And you can look at, how these counties have voted over the years, and you can see a particular trend in some of the counties. So, for example, some people say there's a couple of counties that are not really your typical left-wing counties that are in that list of 22 counties. But if you look at the trend over the last decade, you can see that it's trending Democratic, which means to tell me that in another 10 years from now, it's going to be more Democratic from now. So we wanted to, incorporate the current political dynamic, but also consider what the political dynamic is going to be like in the future, and then build a country based on that, so that we don't have to, I guess, come back to the issue 10 years down the line and do it all over again, because the political dynamics changed to some extent. So as you can see, you're showing here the map of what we're proposing to do. We have these 22 counties along the coast and in the Bay Area. Those are the counties in California that are the most left-wing. Or what happened is there's a county in there, for example, San Luis Obispo County is not exactly a left-wing, radical left-wing county. However, it's important to keep a country that you're building, as we are with the Pacifica here, which is also the Republic of California. It's important to keep it physically and geographically connected to itself. We can't have it be different parts. Some people say, and have wrote us messages saying, we only have to get San Francisco and Los Angeles out. Let them be their own country. Well, you can't really have a country that's two cities and they're separated by 500 miles, right? So we want to have a country on the West Coast there. We're calling it Pacifica, that is not only politically and ideologically homogenous so that they can have the type of government that they want, but we also want them to be able to support themselves economically. We want them to be geographically connected to one another so they can have trains and highways that they can transport goods and services and people around the country without problems. They like the idea of high-speed rail, so they would be able to build a high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco, for example. And so this is the map that we have. It's not a final map. It may be changed in the future based on public comment. But this is the map that we've come up with that incorporates the ideas of a national divorce to separate basically the left-wing West Coast, most coastal areas, from the inland counties of the state, which are much more conservative, but also consider geography, consider the economy, and consider culture. And so we've tried to combine all of those different factors together, and this is what we've come up with.
You said it was St. Louis Obispo, is it a sacrifice, or will they vote to leave?
It's not really a sacrifice. They're still majority Democrat, but it's not like 90% Democrat. Some of those counties, like San Francisco, is like 90% Democrat, and like 7% Republican. San Luis Obispo is more like a 55-45 split, so it's much more down the line. But it is still nonetheless a blue county. It votes blue, and it has been voting blue for a while. And so I think it's important, and we do recognize that there's a difference between your typical San Francisco liberal and California Democrat in, for example, San Luis Obispo. There's a difference there in terms of, yes, they may be voting for Democrats, but there's a difference in culture and belief and ideology and values of a San Francisco liberal and a Democrat up in Humboldt County, for example, which is I think more of a libertarian Democrat in my view. But they're all Democrats, and they, I think, will more closely associate with one another in this country, as opposed to having, for example, just San Francisco and just Los Angeles secede. That's just not a workable country. You don't have a country. You have two city-states at that point in time. So we have to not just consider just the politics. We also have to consider the culture, the geography, the economy. And I think that we've got a map here that works to the most possible benefit to the people of that future country and also to the state of California that exists after that.
So from polls and voting statistics and information from that gathering, you have a pretty good concept. The blue counties, the 22 there, would vote to leave, or to at least to be separate from the red ones. And the red and blue is the good colors because they are red and blue politically. Right? That's why.
Well, it's difficult to say whether or not they would make the jump to secede and vote to secede, but they would definitely have common political association with each other. From Humboldt County down to Los Angeles County, I think that they would all feel that their politics are pretty closely aligned there. Now, of course, you have Trump voters in San Francisco, but they're a very, very small minority. So there's always going to be, as we say, your typical conservative or Republican patriots that are stuck behind enemy lines, so to speak. But that's just the nature of where we live. And it's an unfortunate situation, but political migration is nothing new. It's been around since the invention of the wheel. People have always moved to other locations, other geographic locations because of politics or religion or a combination of the two. The people who settled North America from Europe were doing exactly that. They crossed the ocean in wooden boats to seek out a different political reality for themselves. And so I don't think it would be a big ask if you have your, conservative voter in San Francisco to go and, go up to Redding or go, somewhere else in the Central Valley or Orange County, something like that. If you really don't want to be a part of that progressive utopia.
You would expect some people to move in both directions, right? There will be people that would move into the new, if and when it happens, into the new country. This isn't going to be a situation of splitting East and West Berlin in 1945, where they put up a wall and you can't go see your family.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Like people will be moving, right? The borders. We'd expect free trade agreements and
free trade agreements. Los Angeles gets a lot of its water from the Owens River Valley, which is in the red section. So of course there's going to be commerce. There's going to be water deals. There's going to be travel. In fact, there has to be, because one of the big problems that we have with our own map that we recognize is we point out the problem that the I-5, Interstate 5, runs from south to north, San Diego, Orange County, Los Angeles, through Sacramento and into Northern California. So in order to go from, for example, San Diego to Sacramento or San Diego to Redding, for example, you'd have to drive through this new country twice. You'd have to go through Los Angeles, and then you'd have to go through it again.
It'd go in and out.
You'd go in and out twice, yes. And if you look at the other page on the Instagram, we have a map of where that road or that highway or freeway goes. If you open up that second one, the blue one.
This one?
Yeah.
No, I don't use Instagram, but I can blow it up. Oh, you have to go in it to see?
I think you're not going to be able to open up the gallery, unfortunately.
Okay.
But anyway, people who are familiar with the 5, and they'll understand that you'd have to drive into Pacifica through Los Angeles County, and then come out of it to come out into the Central Valley, and then you'd go back into it again up in the Bay Area before you come out again up in like Sutter County and so on and so forth. So that's a geographic and transportation issue that we have with this map, and it's our map. We recognize that no map is perfect, just like no divorce is going to be perfect. You're always going to have some issues in divorces that are not going to be perfectly ironed out, and this is just another example of a divorce that's not going to be perfect. But all things considered,
there will be negotiations. Who gets the couch? Who gets the car?
Exactly.
And frankly, so you mentioned. I just
want to people this as well, that these progressives on the coast, they like open borders, and so I don't really think that the borders will be closed for the people of California to drive through them.
So Humboldt, you mentioned that's the furthest north one. Is that the
Humboldt County is the furthest north? Yes.
Okay, and then this is before San Diego. This is L.A. What's the southernmost county?
LA County is the southernmost.
Okay, so that's in that, and then there's a couple that go inland around the Bay Area. San Francisco,
that's like
Oakland,
San Joaquin County, Sacramento County, Solano County, Napa County.
But it is mostly the coast. It's interesting that it developed that way. I don't want to get lost in demographics of that, but that is what happened in California. It's the coast.
Pretty good split there. You have a couple of blue counties near the Nevada border, like for example, Alpine County. It's near Tahoe, near Reno, that general vicinity. But again, it didn't make sense for us to say, okay, we're going to have this small county, Alpine County, which has, I think, 1,000 voters total.
Yeah, I was going to say
we're not going to have this little like enclave of a country in the mountains that's separated physically from the rest of its country for 1,000 voters. So that's why, for example, that's a blue county that is in the red area.
And I wonder if they're less blue, less progressive, because of where they live. They're living in more of a rural.
Yeah, they very well may be.
Mountains.
The voting records show that county has been blue. But yeah, they may not be your typical radical left-wing leftist. And so that county remained in the red section, but there's only 1,000 voters there, so it didn't really make sense to have this little speck there separated physically from the rest of the state. So,
and
I also
as you
want point out, if I can, real quick, that
Okay.
when we point out that this is the red section, it's a little bit inaccurate because it still has more registered Democrats than Republicans. And I think, as you pointed out in the introduction, it's pretty evenly split between Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. There's a slight advantage to Democrats, but if you take in consideration the independent vote, it's a pretty good swing state. That it's not going to be a red state. It's not going to be a deep blue state. It's going to be a swing state, and I think it'll be a good thing for the country if you have the state of California as a swing state in national politics, as opposed to this deep blue state that disenfranchises millions of Republican voters in the state who have no voice in national politics or even in state politics. To be honest about it.
Yeah, it's I think I saw it on the website that there would probably be roughly overall, and you have to add all those counties up, but a third independent, a third Republican, a third Democrat, like a lot of the swing states.
Yeah, it's pretty close,
right?
Something like that. And the Pacifica here, the Republic of California, I believe is 3 Democrats to 1 Republican. So
it's overwhelming. So that's a huge difference. 3-to-1 ratio.
Yeah.
You're saying. Wow. Yeah, there's not too many other states that even are that far.
Yeah, and it's 3-to-1, but if you incorporate also third parties and independents, it becomes even more blue because a lot of the independent voters still end up voting for Democrats in the elections, and so it's just overwhelmingly blue when you take the counties on the coast by themselves.
And it'd be interesting to watch what happens. I'll just say when this happens, but if it happens, after a few years of people shifting, because some people will move in both directions. So you'd expect the policies, the new government formed by the new country, Pacifica, or Republic of California, as it says in the graphic, they implement more policies they would go further in that direction than even California state government is now. And when they're free from the burden of the federal government and the influence of President Trump, if you want to call it that, the Republican Party that is slowing them down from what they want to do, they would go further that direction. And I would expect people to move there from not only the other counties of California, but from other parts of the U.S.
Yeah, I agree totally. Not only just California, but the rest of the country as well. There's a lot of people who are progressives in a lot of different states, and they're unhappy with the country that we have today, but for different reasons that someone like me is unhappy with the country we have today. They want to institute a kind of a cultural revolution that brings about a socialist state of some form. And unfortunately, they haven't learned the past mistakes that the world has learned from socialist regimes. And so this will be an opportunity for them to build a little socialist utopia to their best ability on the coast there. And they'll have things like UBI, Universal Basic Income, Medicare for All, universal health care. They'll get rid of all the guns, or they'll at least, on paper, they'll get rid of all the guns. And we'll see how it goes. And maybe they do a good job, and they have a first ever in history of human civilization's socialist society. And all the power to them if they can do it. But history has shown us that's not going to happen. But let them go and let them do their.
Welcome the experiment. And it goes back to the principle, as we were talking about earlier, the right of people to determine their own form of government. I don't object. I don't live in California, so I'm actually not even in a position to object. But the experiment, might look at as an experiment. It's supposed to be. More power to them. I would rather be sitting at the negotiating table working on a free trade agreement than arguing over what laws we both have to have.
Exactly. I totally agree, because it's I talk a lot of I say a lot of negative things about liberals, let's just say. But if they were in a separate country, then I would have less to say about it, because let them do their thing in their country. But what I take issue is with, then they try to take their radical extremist views and try to change my country. and then I have to live under those laws and under those programs and with those taxes and those failures. That's where the problem is. If they want to have their own country on the West Coast, they can do whatever they want to do because I don't live there and it's not my country and I don't have to associate with it, then all the power to them. I have no problem with it.
I think it's and it is the morally correct position to take, is to not rule. Like I want to leave people alone, right? That's the philosophy. I'm not a Libertarian Party member, but I always like the tagline, like the Libertarians are fighting to take over and leave you alone.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to get people together to do that.
That's
but so you would be, I mean, you're personally, besides this movement actually is for both, but you would be the one in the state of California part that stays in the union. Your personal ideology doesn't really matter as far as you describing this. You could be in either section. That's correct.
Well, I didn't understand your question.
That your personally ideologies, the form of government that you would like to live under, you would be in the state of California portion, not the part that leaves.
Well, you know what? I think that even the state of California will be kind of a middle of the road swing state, and I'm more of a right wing nationalist populist Trump voter. So I would choose to live in a red state altogether if I could. But I think that it still would be a step in the right direction because they're in those red counties here, even though it's painted red, it's still kind of a swing state. There are millions of Trump voters there, millions of Republicans, conservatives, libertarians who have no representation in the national politics. No representation or very little representation in Sacramento because the Democrats have super majorities that you don't even need to have a governor anymore, I think, right now, because you can override the governor's veto. And so there's millions of people there, no representation, none. And I think that's a crime against the Constitution. And I think that at least if they're living in a swing state, they have a chance to win an election and they can be represented, at least sometimes, in national politics. Whereas now, they're not represented at all. And I think that the important stat to remember is that there are more people who voted for Trump in California than in any other state. And yet it's called this blue state all the time. I think it's an inaccurate representation. What really is going on is you have a very densely populated coast of radical leftists, and they dominate politics in California. So that's why we're going to divide them from the state of California so that they can have their own socialist utopia, and the rest of the state can live its life as a swing state, and both parties have a fair shot at winning national elections and state elections.
That's an interesting statistic. So more people in California voted for Trump than any other single state.
I think that's the stat that I read somewhere, is that there are more people who voted for Trump in the 2016 or 2020 election than in any other particular state.
It's numerically possible because you're talking 40 odd million, roughly that.
They got about 40 million people. 40 million
far bigger. People. Yeah, the next is Texas at like 30. So yeah, it's a lot of people. Yeah, that's an interesting stat. I have to find out the number on that. So the state of California really just remains the state of California. There actually isn't really a change. It's not a new state.
No, it's not a new state. They have to have a new capital and they have new borders, but it's still the U.S. state of California. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if they want to name it something else, they are free to do that. But we just try to keep it simple on the website. This is the Republic of California. This is the state of California.
State of California.
Since then, we have moved on to moving the name of the Republic of California to Pacifica to even further demonstrate the difference between the two. Because, people say, for example, the state of California, the flag is California Republic. So they're both the California Republic. So we have a new name for the blue part. It's called Pacifica. We've incorporated that into our newer graphics, physical representations. Mm-hmm. And then, so we have Pacifica and the state of California.
And it's cleaner from the point we were actually debating a little earlier, that if you don't actually change California, it's already a state. So California is a state in the U.S. If 22 counties split off and form their own country, that doesn't do anything to California, really. California still exists as the state of California politically. Yeah. But you have to pick a capital. That's interesting. So what would be the biggest city in the California state, the California state part?
Yeah, I guess that would probably be San Diego.
So that's all the way at one side. That's one of the problems, right? The capital
Yeah.
should be somewhere in the middle, especially a big, long state.
Yeah, it's difficult because then it's also like I was saying, they'd have to build new freeways to go around Los Angeles County or whatever. But so we're still working on that. But yeah, it could be Reading, for example, up in the north. It could be somewhere else. I guess that would be up to the people in that state to
Mhm.
decide when it gets to that point in time. There's also other ideas and other people in that state who have desires. For example, the state of Jefferson, to create the state of Jefferson in the north.
Mhm.
So maybe there's a way to have the state of California, divided into Jefferson in the north and keep Southern California as the state of California. So I don't know. There's a lot of different ways that this map can be reorganized, and I think that we're going to try to bring people together in California from the left and the right, and also those who want to have the state of Jefferson. There's the new state of California idea, which is a similar to ours, except for the fact
Mhm.
that their division of the state results in two American states, as opposed to ours is a new country. So there's a lot of people in California who want to change the political makeup
Mhm.
of the state, the borders of the state in some way or another. And I think it's important that they all come together. And it doesn't have to be this idea with CalEx 3.0. It doesn't have to be Jefferson, but maybe we can come up with something that kind of blends all of those ideas together so that there's a broad consensus between people of different political factions. It's one thing that we can all agree on, I think, no matter what CalEx group you talk to or what other kind of group wants to divide the state or do this or that in the state, is that the system and the status quo is broken and people want to see something change.
Yeah, the I had pulled that up earlier, just looking at it. So the state of Jefferson movement is a maybe northeast corner that's been around for a while. I've heard of this one over the years.
Yeah, they've been
Um,
around for decades.
so this is a separate movement, and we were chatting earlier, but I've been since I found out about CalExit this fall, been trying to wrap my head around all the different secession movements, and I'm basically in favor of them all. Like I'm in favor of self governance, so people want to set up their own thing. I don't live in California, so it's not my business. So the state of Jefferson one, the website, I have it up here. I'll put in the show notes on Unsafe Space. I'll put the links we talk about. It's pretty minimal information, but they're talking about looks like a hardcore conservative. Like this is a Republican, vast majority Republican. Is that accurate?
Yeah,
Fair?
definitely. The northern counties of California are very hardcore Republican and conservative, and they are the area that would make up the state of Jefferson. It's basically the entire north of the state, all the way down to like Sacramento and even somewhat beyond Sacramento. But I don't know that they include Sacramento itself, but that general vicinity. I guess you'd have to look at their map. And it's a very Republican red area of the state. They are a different type of Californian because they're more rural, they're Republican, they're conservative, they're living in areas that are more foresty as opposed to like coastal beaches or something like that. And so it's a different area. So they have, together with Southern Oregon, let's not forget Southern Oregon, because the state of Jefferson also includes the idea that they would incorporate parts of Southern Oregon into their state of Jefferson if they were to create one. And I think that the Southern Oregon counties sometimes get overlooked when people talk about the state of Jefferson. But I do support that movement. I think it'd be a good thing if they wanted to, after CalEx 3.0, to have their counties secede from California to create a new state. I think that would be overall a good thing
Mhm.
because it reduces the size of your political entity, and therefore it by default allows for more local governance, more local control of resources, local decisions being made. And so I think that the point that we were getting into a few minutes ago when we mentioned San Diego being the capital is that I don't think that the people in the northern part of the state would appreciate political decisions being decided in San Diego.
It's. I mean, the distance is pretty far. It's probably not that much further. I live in Florida, Washington D.C. People think about that. That's so far away. Why do we have to
Yeah.
pay attention to them? And San Diego maybe wouldn't represent a mix of what this remaining part of California would really be. It is still a city further left maybe than
Yeah,
average.
it is. And it is more, the city itself is more democratic. We decided to keep it in the state of California simply because of two reasons. One, we don't think that the typical Democrat in San Diego is like the Democrats you see in San Francisco and the Bay Area. They're a little bit more moderate, generally speaking. Of course, you have extreme Democrats everywhere, extreme liberals everywhere. Look at, for example, you have Nathan Fletcher and Lorena Gonzalez in San Diego. Those are some of the worst extreme leftists you'll see in California. Just complete fascists of the left, like Marxists, completely. But anyway, most of the Democrats in San Diego are not those extreme Democrats that you see. So we wanted to consider that in the map making, but also the very practical idea that there's a lot of military installations in that area that complicate the question when you talk about having it secede from the Union. There's already going to be a number of military installations in the parts that we're having secede, those 22 counties. Vanderbilt Air Force Base, Travis Air Force Base, McClellan Air Force Base. There's a number of other military facilities, the Presidio Monterey and so on and so forth, where the Defense Language Institute is located in Monterey. So there's already going to be a number of U.S. military facilities that are going to kind of secede in these 22 counties. So having the Americans lose one of their most important naval facilities, and Camp Pendleton, for example, the Marine Corps training facility, I think just further complicates an already complicated issue. So for those two reasons, we kind of decided to keep San Diego County in the state of California.
That would be messy, the whole Naval Air Station and the Navy base there, and a lot of people. And so, and the people that go along with that make that area of California more conservative, more inclined to stay, right?
That's true. And now,
so
it's also
that makes sense.
worth pointing out that the counties that do have American military facilities in them, and those that are seceding, the American military will maintain control and operation of those facilities. They'll just have to, at some point in time, like they do elsewhere around the world, pay some kind of a land lease to this country of Pacifica to be able to operate there. But that's standard procedure. They do that, and that's why we have military bases in Germany, in Japan, and South Korea. They pay leases to these countries, basically. And
that's not unusual. Yeah, it wouldn't even significantly change the amount of U.S. bases overseas. There's
so they can maintain
900, like 900, be 910.
Yeah, and that's why it's such a big economic issue. For example, when they were talking a couple of years ago about maybe we should withdraw our troops from Germany and move them somewhere else because we're focusing on Asia now, and the Germans don't like that because it's a huge economic boost for their towns over there. So it's something that most countries like to have, an American military base. They like the least money for the government budget, but also it's a huge economic boost for the town or city where it's located. Bringing all those American troops in, our military personnel in, they're living there, they're buying things there. It's a boost for the economy there. And so anyway, the Americans do have a number of bases that will kind of secede with these counties, but they'll still remain under American control. The Americans will, at some point in time, I think, begin to pay some kind of a lease for that territory.
So yeah, that sounds reasonable, and it's like many other countries where have overseas bases. So while we're on that topic, what other sorts of objections, pushbacks would you expect from the United States, from the national United States, with losing, if you want to call it losing, that part of California? So the military base is one.
Yeah, so I guess that, it depends on who you ask, because I think if you ask your typical Republicans or conservatives, they're not going to be too upset about it at all if these counties leave. So in that regard, I think that if you talk about the United States and the population, I think that half the population probably supports it, simply because they realize how far extreme these leftists are on the coast and how much it impacts the rest of the country as a whole. So I think that it's important to point out that we would have, I think, a lot of support. But if you're talking about the government itself, of course, you're going to lose. You're going to have some resistance from the government itself because these counties are very important economically speaking. They contribute the majority of California's GDP. So of course, you're going to lose some of your GDP as a result of it.
Yeah, what would the GDP numbers be, since you brought that up? I think that's in the website.
It is. It is in the booklet. If I recall, I believe that they. Gee, I forget the actual percentage.
I'm gonna pop it up
We'll
here.
pull it up at this point in time.
Yeah, that's it, right? So it says 2.21 trillion. That's the Republic of California GDP.
So they would. So they would take about. Well, I wish you could pull up the Instagram graph because we have the Instagram graph that kind of compares the two.
You and my niece. So they want me to go on Instagram. that was one of the social media things I never got into.
Okay. Well, I think that
you can show it.
I don't know how I would show it. How would I show it?
All right. Well, we won't work that out while we're doing the show.
Okay.
Next time,
anyway, you can see that they'll take a majority of the GDP of the state of California with them. So there's lost GDP. But the United States still has the largest GDP in the world. I think they would still have the largest GDP even after this secession. They're going to lose, I think it's 54 or 56% of the population of California. So the American population would decrease to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to lose some territory, physical territory. As you can see, land area-wise, they're going to lose about what's basically almost identical to the size of Portugal. I was pretty surprised when I looked it up because I wanted to compare it to another country. And I think the difference in size is about 6 square miles or 5 square miles in difference between what this country of Pacifica will be and Portugal. So the United States will lose territory about the size of Portugal. The United States will lose a couple $1 trillion in GDP, and they'll lose 22 million residents. However, just because they're losing 22 million residents doesn't mean they're losing 22 million citizens. They will still all be U.S. citizens. You don't lose your citizenship just because you live in another country. I'm living in another country right now and have lived in another country for a number of years, and I'm still a U.S. citizen. And so they'll still be U.S. citizens. They'll, I'm sure, gain some form of citizenship in the country of Pacifica, so they'll be dual citizens in that respect. So because they'll be U.S. citizens, they'll still be able to come to the United States without a visa or permission, just like anybody else. So they're not going to lose, the ability to enter the United States. Like some people think that you secede from the United States and all of a sudden you need a visa to go to Las Vegas. That won't be the case because they'll still have their American passports. And also, I would point out, although I disagree with it in principle, because they're U.S. citizens, they're still going to be responsible for paying U.S. taxes. As Americans overseas have to do. You have to file your taxes every year, even if you're living in another country. So they will still have to, uphold their responsibilities as U.S. citizens until they, if they decide to, give up their citizenship.
Yeah, or there's an agreement reached, related to a dual citizenship. But yeah. You mentioned a few reasons why the 22 counties would leave the United States and form a new country. Getting away from the IRS would be one. Now, they may actually have more income taxes as a citizen of the new one. I don't know what they're going to do.
I think they like paying taxes because they want to have the nanny state. They want to have universal basic income. They want to have universal health care, which are in general, like you were saying earlier, those are generally good ideas. Like the principle of it, I think that everybody should have health care. I think that everyone should have enough income to support themselves. Do I think it should be coming from the government? No, it's a different situation. Mm-hmm. But I kind of agree with people who support these ideas of universal health care, universal income, because I do want people to be able to be healthy and be able to take care of themselves. But I don't think that we should be taxing everybody and then redistributing that money to everybody, or those who don't have it, or those who didn't pay taxes. That's socialism. I don't agree with socialism. But I'm saying in an ideal world, people can support themselves, have their basic needs taken care of, or have their basic needs, and are healthy.
It's the problem, the standard, who will build my roads fallacy. That, like, if you think that something's a good idea, therefore the government has to do it. That conclusion doesn't work, really. It may be better if the government doesn't do it. In fact, looking at things, it's almost always better if the government doesn't do it. But
Yeah,
I'll
Geographic doesn't
leave
have a
it at
good track.
that. Yeah, I'm not trying to debate which one would be better, which will succeed better, the state that's leaving or not. Principle is that if they want to leave, they can, um, and they should. I think they should. People should determine their own government, and it resolves this dispute, these irreconcilable differences that we see in the news every day. California, or between California and other parts of the United States, the differences look irreconcilable to me. I think they are irreconcilable at this point. So I don't see another way out than secession in general. It doesn't look to me like this 50 member union, everybody together will work. We're not one nation in the sense of being one people on one ideology and one language and one culture. And the United States was never one nation, and California isn't even one nation. I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
you've brought up more than two already. There's more than that, really. It's, you just kind of have somewhat like-minded people form a society. In the end, we're just talking about this line, this political line shouldn't be here, it should be over here. Like, you don't think we should kill 1 million people for that, right? Because you
Yeah,
want to move the
exactly.
line.
Yeah, and this idea that you're bringing up about national divorce, I think that what's interesting about our CalExit 3.0 ballot measure is that it will be the first example of a national divorce themed ballot measure in the country, where we're dividing a political entity based on its ideology, so that both sides can be more politically homogenous, and there's less political division and polarization in those resulting entities. And so what we'd like to do is set the example, is that if we can do this in California, where we can divide the state ideologically between the left and the right, then I think that other states can do the same thing. I know that, for example, in Oregon and Washington states, there's also a very similar divide there between the western and eastern parts of the states. Basically, the mountains, the Cascades, separate the leftist coast areas from the more conservative inland areas. I know that, for example, in western Washington state, it's a pretty conservative area, but they're outnumbered and outpopulated by Seattle and the metropolitan area. And so it's a blue state. But there are...
Eastern, I just want to correct, Eastern Washington is what you meant.
Yeah, Eastern Washington.
Okay.
Yeah. And Eastern Oregon as well. Also, some of the most conservative areas of the country are in Oregon and Washington. And so they're not represented either at the national level. So maybe they would be able to do a similar thing where they could divide the state in two. Or maybe what could happen is the western coastal areas of Oregon and Washington can combine together with Pacifica, and they have a Pacifica country from the Canadian to the Mexican border practically along the west coast. So that's another idea. They can pursue that if they'd like to as well. It looks like you're bringing up here the idea of greater Idaho.
Oh, yes. I'm sharing while I'm searching, huh? Yeah, I thought I was being slick while you were talking.
No,
Go
okay.
ahead. Keep going.
And it, I think I've seen that, and that basically incorporates that very idea that these counties in the eastern parts of Washington and Oregon, it's difficult to talk about eastern Oregon and Washington because they're western states. So it's eastern part of these most western states are very conservative, and there's this movement, as you're bringing up now, to maybe join Idaho because it'd be more reflective and representative of their political views.
I was recently reading about this because they're one of the counties. It's hard for me to see the name there. Wallowa County, the one in green, is about to have a citizens referendum to join Idaho, and all these ones in red, they've already voted. So these counties have voted to join Idaho in this greater Idaho movement. And the Idaho state legislature, from what I've read, is on board. If they get enough counties to do this constitutionally, it falls into the restriction that to create or move a state boundary within an existing state requires permission of both state legislatures and of Congress. But they've already gotten pretty far in Oregon. It looks like that might be possible to get the Oregon legislature to agree. And the Idaho legislature already agrees. I think it would be a hard sell for Congress to stop this. It's a version of secession. It's not, you wouldn't define this as national divorce. This is not national divorce, but it's secession.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a mixture, because one thing that I think is a misunderstanding of national divorce is that people believe that national divorce means that we're going to divide the country into two, a blue country and a red country, and you're going to have, for example, California, Oregon, and Washington in the same country as Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts, but not connected to each other because the whole interior of the country is in another country. I don't subscribe to that understanding of national divorce. My idea of national divorce is that we're going to ignore basically the existing state lines and draw new ones that make sense. And we can divide the country into, for example, the West Coast, Oregon, Washington, and California along the coast that represents the left. And then you could do another country in the Northeast that incorporates Maine and Massachusetts and Connecticut, Rhode Island, and maybe the parts of New York and Long Island and New Jersey that are all kind of politically homogenous. And so I don't agree that we should divide the country based on, well, the 2020 election results, Electoral College have this state as red, this one is blue, so we're going to divide into two countries based on a particular Electoral College result. I think that we should ignore the existing state lines because they were arbitrarily drawn, and they really don't reflect the populations that live there. As you can see, in Oregon, you have this state whose lines were drawn whenever they were drawn, and now you have half of its territory politically more aligned with the neighboring state, and they should be living in that neighboring state. I support the Greater Idaho movement. Same thing we have in Jefferson. Same thing we have with the New California movement. In every state, you have the same problem. Every single state. And there's some simple solutions that can be made, such as Greater Idaho, which I think is more complex because it involves so many counties. But there's also some examples, I think, of small examples that can be made and realize that make a big difference. For example, if you look at Indiana and you look at the county where Gary, Indiana is located, it's in the Chicago metropolitan region. I think their time zone is with Chicago specifically because the people who live in Gary, Indiana, are more associated with Chicago, but they're in the red state of Indiana. And so if you were to move this one county of Indiana into Illinois, you would be moving I think it's a blue county into a blue state, and they would be better represented because they'd be not only in a blue state that represents them politically, but they'd also be in the same state with which they are in time zones. And also they'd be in the same state with which they are in a metropolitan complex where they're coming to and from work, commuting to and from work. They're not going into a different state when they do so. Not that it makes a difference really in real terms that, I crossed the state border when I came home from work. But I mean, wouldn't it be nice to live and work in the same state? And that's just one county that I think would make a big difference in terms of Indiana. Indiana's already a red state, but it would be even more of a red state if you were to get that one particular county to go into Illinois. And you could do this across the board. I know that I'm actually born in Buffalo, New York. I'm from upstate New York. And I know that there's always been talk there about separating upstate New York from the Long Island area. And so, everywhere you go, I'm sure that there's a divide in Florida as well, in certain areas. And I think you can find it just about everywhere you go, except for in the center of the country. Maybe you find, in Oklahoma and Kansas, Nebraska, I don't think you're going to find a big left-right divide there as much. But in the populous states, I'm pretty sure all of them have a left-right divide in some context that already exists. And if we can draw the lines in a way that makes sense, not only ideologically, but also culturally and economically and geographically, then we can have a real, I think, national divorce.
And Florida, since you brought it up, Florida has large segments of further left Democrat-leaning areas, and it's typical in the whole United States. The cities tend to be more progressive left Democrat voting, and the rural areas are more conservative, right, and libertarian and independent. I live in a county on the East Coast, southern East Coast, that's generally conservative. It was great during COVID because I was in one of the best counties in one of the best states as far as that goes, masks and stuff. But the state itself overall, people think, we often talk about Florida being like overwhelmingly, like it's totally bright red. And that's not true. There's big cities. We got Orlando, we got Tampa. There's parts of Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, Broward County, Miami. There's big sections that are ban guns, universal income.
Yeah.
The last, DeSantis won everybody knows who he is, right? The governor of Florida. He won overwhelmingly the last election, but the first election, he only won by 0.5%. So people there's a good way to just say what Florida is really pretty divided too. And there's been talk, you see I'm one of the admins on the Flexit page, Florida Exit. And, there are groups that talk about dividing Florida on a north-south boundary.
Okay.
But the problem even with doing that is they happen to take out my county when doing that. Like, why? Do you realize what's happening? That doesn't really work either. And if you go down into Miami, so it's a huge city. Like Miami-Dade County's bigger than some states, right? As far as population and GDP and trade and everything. But Miami has a huge Cuban population, which a lot of those people live through Castro revolution. Like, they do not want communism. So in the midst of this city is what you might walk in, like somebody from New York, the Northeast, who has this idea of what Latinos are. You walk into parts of Miami and you think this is the actually opposite of what you think it would be, because these people's parents escaped Castro's regime in the 60s. And so, they grew up sitting around the house listening to stories of what happens with communism. So there's large parts of southern Florida that are would surprise some people, how conservative they are, or libertarian, hardcore libertarian. So Florida's messy too. I don't know how you would divide Florida. It would be the same problem. It would end up being a squiggly line. If you did a county vote, there would be counties that would be stuck on the wrong side. The north-south is not too far off, but you have the Orlando problem, because Orlando is very left. So I don't know exactly how to divide Florida. Maybe Florida should just leave altogether. But
I would probably agree with that idea, simply because, like you said, it's a peninsula, so you're limited in your geographic options with how to divide it. Probably better to go as a whole. It has a history of being that particular entity, the Florida entity, before it was part of the United States even. So I think that would probably be best in that example. And not every state has to be split up. I mean, some states can outright just cede or whatever. But there are a number of states, like California, New York, that I think do need to have a division.
New York is another clear one, like California, because New York City is completely the opposite of Buffalo.
Yeah, and it's
for
not even just New
example,
York City. It's also some
all
of
of
the
Long Island.
counties on the Hudson Valley, going a little bit north of there as well. So there's a lot of counties in upstate New York that are nothing like New York City. You got California, you got Oregon, you got Washington. You could even look at Arkansas. I like to look at sometimes, because look at the political division of Arkansas. Is the Mississippi River Valley is in Little Rock, for example, more Democratic regions. It's still a red state, and the representative in Congress, I think his name was Rick Crawford, is representing that general vicinity. He's still a Republican, but there is, to a lesser extent, because not as pronounced, of course, it's still a red state. There's still that difference between the Mississippi River Valley of Arkansas, along the east side of Arkansas, and the rest of the state, which is much more conservative.
It's a difficult problem to divide it up, but what you're just bringing this up and talking about it is the first key. I mean, that's how you have a successful, amiable relationship after divorce, is you got to start talking about how things get divided up like this. So it is a negotiation, and it's probably true in a lot of states. I think California doing something, one of these various versions, will inspire and be a model for other states to start thinking about it. My view personally, I just see what's going on in Washington, D.C., both with Trump and with Biden. And I didn't vote for either one of them. I said, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. They both caused huge problems. All I see is that we've got this irreconcilable differences. I don't know if maybe it's easier to split up into 50 separate ones. I don't know. There's large parts of the Northeast that I could see going together.
Yeah,
Massachusetts,
I don't
Connecticut,
know if I
Long
would agree
Island.
with the 50 state idea, because some of the states I think can't really manage as independent country. I mean, what are you going to have? Country of Rhode Island, for example, I don't think would really work. But I think if you take the Northeast from Maine and Massachusetts and Connecticut and that area, maybe even down to New Jersey and northern Delaware, I think you could have a country there that'd be very successful. Even
Mhm.
parts of upstate New York along the what lake is that up there? I forget the name of it. Lake Champlain, I think.
Champlain.
Uh, Over there in that general vicinity, I think is a little more Democrat leaning as well. Albany as well could go maybe into that section of the country. You have parts, and if you wanted to go deeper in inland into like Scranton, Ohio, more Democrat regions. Philadelphia, of course, it would be a Democrat. So Philadelphia, northern Delaware, New Jersey, part of Long Island, the New York City area of Long Island, and
Mhm.
of course the New England area. I think that could be a great country for
There's
the
and the lines would not be where they are. There's plenty of people that would draw the Pennsylvania line kind of down the middle. Certainly, the northwest corner of Pennsylvania would not want to go with Philadelphia
Oh yeah,
or
sure. So
Scranton,
just take
and
Philadelphia and Scranton, put
and
them
up
in with the
in
Northeast.
and up in New England, like New Hampshire was the highest state on the Freedom Index last year. So, like New Hampshire's
Well,
not going along with New Jersey. I can tell you
that's
that.
I
Um,
specifically didn't list New Hampshire
yes,
in that list of states because I was like, well, that's a little more
New
libertarian. They're
Hampshire's
not so crazy.
better off on its own, and Texas. So yeah, the Rhode Island one is interesting, but to remember, Rhode Island was the last one to join. Right, Rhode Island was the holdout in 1788.
Yeah,
They they didn't they didn't even sign the Constitution, right? Like right away. So I don't know. I don't know the numbers, but I doubt Rhode Island would be the smallest country in the world. Most
of course.
countries are
No,
pretty
I
small.
just don't think it would really
Yeah.
be.
Most US states are bigger than most countries. Even a smaller US state leaving would still be fairly big. I think the numbers in your website, what California would be like ninth biggest in the world or something. Texas is in there too, 12th biggest GDP in the world. I don't remember the number exactly, but
Yeah.
Florida's up there too. Florida would probably be in the top 20. It's pretty big. We're 22 million people, and Florida would be an economic powerhouse on its own.
Sure.
Plenty of trade and all that. So the bigger states are easier. So as far as California goes, one of the arguments you often hear is this bigger is better. We have to stay together. It's the Lincoln argument. Part
Strength
of
in
the Lincoln
numbers.
argument: strength in numbers, division. You must get pushback on that, at the whole idea of splitting California in two. So how do you address that bigger is better argument?
Well, I don't address it so much as I simply tell people that we have a state in California which is about 40 million people, and millions of them lack representation in national politics. They lack representation in Sacramento. You have one party rule in Sacramento, and you have most of the people who put those in power in Sacramento living in a geographically confined area along the coast. And so, because they're predominantly living on the coast, they all predominantly share the same ideology, and they're in control. Why do they have the right to dominate politically the rest of the state? 78% of the state is not land-wise, is not a liberal county or a leftist political area. 55% of the state in terms of population is. That means that 44% of the state is not, or does not identify with that leftist politics. And so if you have a population of 40 million people and 45% of them are not represented, that is not a successful situation. It's not a successful scenario. So why not divide the state into two and let both, or let's just say all 40 million Californians have better representation, because the people on the left, on the coast, are going to be able to do what they want to do. They feel, I talked to someone today and they said to me, California is not a leftist state. We can't do the things that we want to do in California because of the Republicans. We can't do universal basic income. We can't do universal health care. We can't ban weapons in this state because of the Republicans. So they feel like they don't have the country that or the state that they want to have. And they're the ones who are in control of Sacramento for decades. I think it's a pretty crazy idea, but if that's the way that they believe, and that's what they think, then let's let them have a state of their own where they have so much political homogeny that they'll be able to do whatever they want to do on every public policy issue that there is, and it doesn't have to affect everybody else in the country, and it doesn't have to, disenfranchise 45% of the state that doesn't agree with that.
So I understand the argument that it would be cleaner for the whole state to leave together, just because it's already a political entity with a government and the whole bit and lines. But I think the argument that you're going down, if just think of it as it leaves the same problem in place that we see in the United States, the 50-state version of the Union now. If all of California seceded, would you consider that the ideological differences that would remain in California would be a smaller version of what we have now in the United States?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to kill two birds with one stone. We don't want to having a state secede from the Union is an enormous undertaking already. So if we go down that path and we succeed, and after all that work and trouble, we still have a politically polarized country with 45% of the population without representation that don't even want to be a part of that country. They were taken against their will. I think you're going to have a very unstable situation politically. So what we want to do is have the secession and at the same time solve some of the underlying problems that are in California. And that, I think, is when it comes to the lack of representation in Sacramento and the general political profile of the state. So if we can divide the state first, you solve several problems. First of all, you solve the very practical issue of the American government loses less. That just makes the a more easy sell. If they lose less, they lose fewer people, they lose fewer square kilometers or square miles of territory, they lose fewer military facilities, and so on and so forth. That's already easier to sell. Still very difficult to sell, of course, but it's easier. Secondly, if you can solve the problem of the political representation, then at least the seceding country, when it does succeed, it will be a country, I think, that can operate functionally, even though I disagree with the policies that they will pursue, and maybe they will end up becoming a failed state like Venezuela as a result of those policies. They will be able to function at least in some form of political harmony. And I think that's generally a good thing. Whereas if they were to secede with the whole population, the whole state of California, they're not going to have that political harmony. And by the way, you're probably going to have millions of partisans in the hills going to be, insurrectionists against this new country of California because they were taken against their will. If you have a referendum statewide with, passing by 55 or even 60% of the vote, you're still going to have 40% of the voters who didn't just lose a presidential election or a Senate election or a referendum on marijuana. They lost their country, basically. They're now not living in their own country. They're not going to be silent about that. They're not going to be, we'll win next year. We have, there's always 2026. There's always 2028. There's not going to be that type of acquiescence, I think. You're going to have a lot of people that are going to be, I think, revolting against that system. So why pull them against their will? Why pull them kicking and screaming with you just so you can argue with them after the referendum? It doesn't make any sense at all to take them with you.
So you'd see the day after the entire state seceded as one unit, which is one of the ongoing California secession movements now. I think you referred to it as CalExit 2, or they call it CalExit. To take the whole state, the day after that was successful, there'd be a new secession movement, which was part of California trying to leave the new country. And maybe go back to the United States or make a new country. Who knows? That would probably happen, right? So that's your argument, I think.
So I think that a lot of people may pick up and leave. Well, there are already a lot of people leaving California now. Let's not forget about that. There's already a huge exodus out of California now, especially amongst conservatives. And so that's not anything new. But I think that this secession of the whole state would put that up on steroids. I think that there'd be a lot of people moving, even if it was to live in the desert in Nevada until they got their bearings about where they were going to go. I think they would just cross the borders to be there.
The U-Haul ratio would get even higher.
Yeah.
I think the U-Haul ratio is like over 3-1 for California. I remember looking it up for somebody that moved to Texas, 3-1. And I moved to Florida a while ago from the Democratic People's Republic of New Jersey. So yeah, that's a 3-to-1 U-Haul ratio too. That it costs 3 times as much to rent a U-Haul to go from New Jersey to Florida as it does to go from Florida back. You can rent a full-size U-Haul and they'll practically pay you to drive it to New Jersey if you pay for the gas. They're glad to have them back up there.
Yeah.
I've heard in California, there's actually people have the job where they fly to Texas and drive an empty U-Haul truck back to California. Like that's a job that U-Haul has to pay people to do that because otherwise all the trucks are in Texas.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that problem would go further. Go ahead.
Yeah. You were mentioning the other, I guess, campaign there. I would say that CalExit 3 is CalExit 3 because it's an evolution. And CalExit has always been CalExit. Whether you're talking about CalExit 1 or 2 or 3, it's always been the same organization. So yes, California was the sponsor of CalExit 1.0. That was the campaign deck in 2017 following the Trump election to put the referendum on the ballot to have the entire state of California secede. We rushed that ballot initiative simply because of the unexpected election of Donald Trump and the huge upswelling of support from the people in California for that ballot initiative. We weren't ready, but there was so many people that wanted to do it. We even had supporters in Silicon Valley financing it or promising to finance it. And I had 20,000 emails from volunteers. We just had so much going for the idea that we'll put it out there. We're not organized, but you guys want an initiative, we'll put it out there. We put it out there, and predictably, we didn't have the organizational structure in place to get it qualified. So we ended up doing CalExit 2.0, which was the following year. But we had some trouble with that, similar problems with that as well. By that time, the mainstream media. Say what the difference?
Yeah, well, so 1 was triggered by the Trump. That was the original one. I think that's probably when people first started hearing about this concept. And you're referring to that as CalExit 1.
No, we didn't call it CalExit 1 at the time. We didn't call it CalExit 1 at the time.
Oh, World War I was called the Great War. They didn't need a number yet.
Yeah, didn't need numbers yet. We didn't even call CalExit. Well, we kind of called CalExit 2.0 because we had a book that we published called California's Future 2.0, and so, or something to that effect. And so that was the first time we actually used a kind of a number associated with it to differentiate it from the first attempt. The second attempt was basically the same idea. I think that we tweaked a couple of provisions of our initiative a little bit, but it was basically the same idea. The whole state would secede. There are still some people in California that are that believe in that, and some of the other groups in California that support the secession of the state that support that idea. But CalExit 3.0 is an evolution and a rebirth. And I say that because CalExit 3.0 does not involve, as we've talked about, the entire state seceding from the Union. So it's an evolution because the idea has changed as we've gone, I think, deeper down this hole of political partisanship and the problems that we have in this country that have people like me and you supporting something like national divorce. Those things have only gotten worse over time since we started this whole idea back in 2014, 2015. So because the situation on the ground has changed and the political atmosphere has changed, we've evolved the campaign to incorporate the idea of national divorce in CalExit. However, there is a disagreement amongst Californians and some people don't want to split up the state. And so that's why some people have remained pushing the original idea of the whole state as a whole entity seceding from the Union. I personally disagree with them for the reasons I just outlined. But nonetheless, they want to pursue that issue, and they're free to do so. CalExit 3.0 with Yes California is now splitting the state based on its ideological lines and then having the left coast secede from the Union. That's an evolution, and it's also the rebirth. The rebirth is important because I say that because the Yes California now has returned to its original philosophical beliefs and roots. And what I mean by that is before the campaign grew in popularity and before the Trump election, we existed. We were a small activist, volunteer, grassroots campaign doing our thing in California. We got positive press attention because it wasn't really a threat to the status quo. We were just these kind of quirky secessionists in California who wanted to become an independent country. Barack Obama was president, all is good, so there's no problems with that, right? So we got positive press attention. And it didn't matter that we were a group that was led by me, someone who's a Republican, and someone like my colleague Marcus Ruiz Evans, who's also a former Republican, who was a well-known talk radio host on Republican channels. So that didn't matter, though, because our campaign wasn't a threat, and nobody really thought it was going to go anywhere. So they tolerated it. Oh, this Republican, it didn't matter. And this Republican didn't matter. It mattered, though, when Trump got elected, because all of a sudden there was this groundswell of support. And so that's when things really kind of changed for us. And so when that happened, we got a lot of new members. And as a result of that, our campaign was unfortunately kind of hijacked by the far left. And
Or
that's
it was changed, right?
So
So
it was changed because
when the new members came in, it was changed.
when new members came in, it influenced the political decisions and the political ideology of the group itself. Just the game of numbers, right? No longer was it just, for example, Marcus and I and a couple of handful of close advisors who had different opinions on political issues, but were willing to put those aside for the greater issue. Now, all of a sudden, you had people who wanted to come into the campaign and take it over so that there was, for example, universal basic income, so that there was universal health care. And so these left-wing policies really kind of hijacked, I say, the campaign. And so for CalExit 2.0, it was much more of a progressive message we had.
So that's what you used to define the 2.0. I was just trying to get the numbers in my head straight.
Yeah, 2.0
so
is basically
1.0 was
the
original. Both 1 and 2, you use those names to refer to the whole state of California leaving.
That's right.
But 2 is a more progressive ideology. And that happened from the Trump voters. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, all those
I can
new
see that
members
change.
Yeah.
I can see that change. I might only I don't know. I'm not familiar enough, but I might push back. Like, it wasn't hijacked. It kind of morphed because the new members came in, changed things.
I mean, I think I felt like
it's
it was
yours word.
because these are people that are political opportunists and who 2 years prior to Trump being elected, when, for example, Marcus and I were standing on the street by ourselves, would have laughed at us because we were supporting California secession and Barack Obama was president. All of a sudden, oh, you guys, this is a great idea. We should secede because Trump is president. And so they come in, they're opportunists, and they change, and they come into the group to try to change our group, and we were just outnumbered. And so I say it was hijacked.
The Trump changed a lot of things. And there's a lot of people start talking about national divorce and secession from Trump. And now from Biden, it's the same effect, really. I don't actually even distinguish between the two. Both Trump and Biden caused secession to be talked about more. It's different groups. There's a different incentive, but it's the same effect. Yes,
yeah,
and
so
the
that's
opposite.
The problem, is that
it affects different people.
Secession based on who's the current president, and so it kind of rotates between the left and the right. Who's supporting secession?
And all that does is just show the need to break up. It's when it's going to flop again next time. Who knows? It's going to keep flopping.
So that's what I think.
Okay, so that history is helpful to understand it.
Our campaign philosophically from the beginning was about classical liberalism. We talked about the Declaration of Independence. We talked about civil liberties. We talked about the principles of the Enlightenment. We talked about freedom of association. Those were the basic ideas. You didn't really hear about that as much in 2018 with CalExit 2.0. You heard more about California's an independent country, can do X, Y, and Z. And don't you want that because you're a liberal, right? So now CalExit 3.0 is going back to that original idea of being a campaign based on classical liberalism, not neoliberalism, but classic liberalism, kind of things that we've been talking about today. I certainly don't sound like, I'm sure any of your viewers will say, I don't sound like you're a liberal progressive or anything like that. And that's because that's not how the campaign was founded. It was a campaign founded while Barack Obama was president by two people with a Republican conservative history, but who were willing to put that aside for the greater cause. And so Marcus and I, we were different because we didn't care about the politics so much, about the left wing, right things, politics at the time, because that wasn't what was the issue. What issue was California, and so we got to give Marcus credit for that, because he stood up to a lot of the people in California during our first CalExit effort to prevent it from becoming a left-wing organization. And unfortunately, in 2018, I was already living overseas, so I wasn't in the picture as much. He was by himself, and he had to kind of acquiesce to the control that was, delegated to the people who took over our campaign that year. But now we've kind of reorganized, and we have new members, and we have a new core group of advisors who are helping us put together a new campaign.
So I thought of another possible objection, like with the split. Do you think not having the direct access to the Mexican border would be a part of California that would leave? They would say, well, we want San Diego to have Mexican border. Or have you heard pushback from that? I just thought of this.
I haven't heard that particular issue yet, but I guess my initial reaction would be that most of the people who would care about that would be in San Diego or Riverside County or Imperial County or San Bernardino County, Orange County, the southern counties, more than so much the northern counties. Of course, LA is going to care about that, I think, more than San Francisco. But I think that most of those counties that are seceding are not your counties that are so concerned so much with the immigration issue as much as Southern California would be.
In the end, I guess we'd say, well, how are they going to vote? How does San Diego County vote? That would kind of answer the question. That would answer the question for me. But I was just thinking of some objections. You brought up water, so I think you had a good answer for that. That would just be part of a trade. And both sides would have incentive to keep that going. One side's making money, the other side needs water. That's what trade's about, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people have the misconception that all of California's agriculture comes out of the Central Valley, which would be in the red state of California. But there's a lot of agricultural production on the coast where we have in Napa Valley, wine country is part of the blue area. So if they want to have, California is famous for its wine industry, they're going to have to provide the country of Pacifica with water. If they want to have the products that are grown on the Gold Coast, they're on the Santa Barbara County, San Luis Obispo, and that general vicinity. There's a lot of agriculture there. Ventura County, they're going to need to provide the water to those regions. So there's going to be a quid pro quo. You provide us the water, we provide you with the grapes and the wine.
You can see that being of obvious free trade agreement.
Oh yeah,
if we can have one with Mexico and Canada.
Grapes, if you go to the store down in Florida and you get grapes, aren't they from California?
They might come from Argentina, Mexico.
Really?
But we get a lot of fruit from the east coast of South America here. But yeah, some stuff comes from Florida.
Or California.
I mean, from California. There's a lot of fruit grown in Florida too. So I'm not sure about grapes actually. But anyway, as far as making wine, that doesn't work here at all. So yeah, our wine, Florida would still want to import wine, and we wouldn't want to have to pay a tariff for California wine. So I think that trade will still happen. I didn't realize that Napa Valley. So there's a lot of farming that would go with it. That was another question. I said, would all the farming end up remaining in the state that stays? And the answer to that's no. A lot of it would be part of the new country.
They take Napa Valley. They take the Gold Coast there. There's a lot of some of the most productive counties are in the Gold Coast there. So
how about other industries in general? Is there another industry that would be? And I'm thinking of objections why people wouldn't want to split the state up.
Well, of course, you're going to have, for example, I believe that Google and Facebook, Instagram is all in the Silicon Valley region or San Francisco Bay Area region.
Have them.
So that's all, your social media and your technology areas, all that kind of stuff. People might say
that's
should
fine.
be part of the United States. Of course, there's going to be like Hollywood, which I'm pretty sure you don't object to either going, but people will say, "Oh, we'll lose Hollywood." So of course, they're going to have Hollywood. They're going to have social media giants. They're going to have those tech startup, all that kind of venture capitalism. That whole economy is going to go with them.
There's a lot of mostly quiet because they want to keep their job tech people in Silicon Valley that will just abandon this. And so, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you see a new social media companies starting up in Dallas if this happens. Or they would move east and get on the other side of the line, because you got to keep your mouth shut in Silicon Valley to keep your job. I'm a tech guy, so you know a little bit about that, but you can't. You got to be careful what you hang in your cubicle, Silicon Valley, right? If you're a libertarian, but there's probably more there than we know about. So that would show up, and yeah, Facebook and Google. As far as I'm concerned, personally, they can have both of them.
The other thing is,
So the border. That's what I was thinking about industry. So that's an interesting one that a lot of the Silicon Valley tech firms will go. But there's big tech hubs starting in other places. We would, So okay, that's a couple. Go ahead.
There's also the ports. There's 3 of America's biggest ports would be in these counties. So you got the port of Los Angeles, the port of Long Beach, and the port of Oakland are 3 of America's top 10 ports. So those are huge ports for importation and exportation of goods. So, but that creates an opportunity and a need for commerce between Pacifica and the rest of the United States. So again, I always try to emphasize people, secession doesn't mean you're seceding from the planet. You're still going to be in North America, and there's going to be commerce between the 2 entities after the treaty is signed. So the fact that Pacifica, people say, oh, it's a small country, it's surrounded by the United States, it's going to be taken over by the United States, or it's not going to be able to support itself. Well, they have 3 major ports. They have agriculture industry, they have the tech industry, they have the media industry with like Hollywood and Los Angeles Times, Sacramento Bee, all that kind of stuff. They have what they need to be a country if they don't screw it up. And they have some things that America needs so that they can kind of force the issue when it comes to trade. They need water from the Owens River Valley, which is going to be in the state of California. But in California, they need grapes, and they need other things that are grown in the Golden Coast. And they need to have products that are shipped from China arrive at ports in Long Beach and Los Angeles and Oakland so that they can get their Amazon deliveries on time. So there's going to be a lot of need on both sides of the border for there to be cooperation. And so we encourage cooperation. Secession does not mean that they're leaving the planet, and it doesn't mean that we have to hate each other. The actual purpose of national divorce is to have more friendly and cordial relationships afterwards, simply because we're no longer interfering with the domestic politics of each other. And so I think that that's one of the key benefits of national divorce, is that the result of that is that we can have more political stability and peace in North America, simply because people in California or the West Coast are not telling the people in Texas or Florida how to live, and the people in Texas and Florida are not telling the people on the California coast how to live.
Okay, now I'm going to ask a question from the other side. So for the part of California that remains in the United States, that would still be called California, why do you think they want to stay in the United States?
Well, I think
separate from leaving with Pacifica, as you call it, the left-leaning. Why wouldn't they want to form their own country too?
Well, I think that the most of people who identify themselves as conservative Republicans, which is what these areas are full of, are patriots. They love America. They're happy to be American citizens, and they would not want to leave their country to go with Pacifica. So I think that if you look at the inland counties, I think that's where you're going to find, your Trump voters, your Make America Great Again voters, your Ron DeSantis supporters, people who put the American flag up on their porches or fly the American flag in front of their homes. I think that these people are by and large more patriotic, and you're more typical American, so to speak, than the people on the coast. So I don't think that they would want to go with Pacifica, and I don't think that they would want to go as a whole state together with the left, because of what we talked about before with how there would be that political strife, and that they would be going against their will and be taken against their will, and they would be, I think, resistant to that.
So I understand that, and that actually seems obvious to me from what you've said about the demographics. The question, separate question is, why wouldn't they want to start their own country? I'm not talking about leaving with Pacifica. 2 different secession movements, both new countries. Why do they want to stay in the United States? That isn't as obvious to me, because it isn't. The United States is not what you described majority. it's still, the United States would still be a mess, even if the Pacifica 22 counties split away. You still have huge areas for conservatives that would be a problem.
Well, I think I haven't thought about that particular issue about why these remaining counties would want to become their own country as well. But I guess my initial reaction would be that there would be a sense that they have newfound representation and a newfound voice, that maybe they could affect how things are going in Washington, D.C. I think that they, at least initially, there would be this idea that, well, hey, we have a state now that we have representation both at the state level and at the national level, and we can affect change. And if they didn't affect change, then who knows what they would do? Maybe they would, maybe Jefferson would materialize, or maybe something else would materialize. But who knows? I think I think they would feel like they would have newfound voice that they would at least attempt to use to affect the status quo. But I think it's important that Washington, D.C. is the problem, and the government in Washington, D.C. is the problem. It's not the country as a whole. And so I think that if we get rid of the most extreme parts of the country, when it comes to the California coast, for example, I think you do a great deal of good work towards moderating the country away from some of those extreme anti-American views. And so there might be less of a need then to leave the country if they're taken out of the country, because then those people like Nancy Pelosi, for example, the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, are no longer in Washington, D.C. And then maybe Washington, D.C. won't be, it's of course wishful thinking, I guess, but maybe Washington, D.C. won't be as bad as it is today, simply because you don't have the Nancy's of Pelosi's of the world there. But still, anyway, Washington, D.C. is an entity that was created out of thin air. It was a city that was built specifically to be the capital. It's the problem that we have. So when I have a problem with America, when I criticize America and we're talking about the American government, I'm talking about Washington, D.C. And that's the cesspool of everything that is wrong with America is in Washington, D.C. And so I think that if we were to able to get some of the most radical elements removed from Washington, D.C., you would have a lesser need for people to break away from the United States to have their own country.
So, the argument would be, or the position would be, that let's see what happens. They would say it's going to be better. Let's see what would happen. But they're still in a country with Massachusetts and New Jersey and Austin, Texas, even, and Milwaukee and Michigan. And so it might not change. I'm throwing this out there as a question. Maybe you said you hadn't thought too much about this, but personally, if I was in the part that was splitting, I'd be like, okay, we're voting to split. Like, let's leave. And I don't want to go with Pacifica. I want to let's start our own thing, and decide for ourselves, because Washington, D.C., as you brought up, is the problem. And this CalExit 3 doesn't solve that problem for the eastern part. They still have the problem, which is Washington, D.C. Even if it does get a little better, it will get a lot better having their state become a swing state. So that's a good point. I understand.
They'll have that newfound voice, and they'll may be able to win a presidential election here or there. So at least they feel like they can affect changes. Right now, those 45% of the population, they vote for a Republican president, but they never have that electoral sway. Now, the new state of California, after the counties on the coast secede, they'll have about 24 electoral votes. And so they'll still be a very powerful electoral voice, be the same as, for example, both the Carolinas combined in terms of electoral power. So that's significant. It's not like they'll all of a sudden become Iowa. People say, "Oh, you're going to take all the people with you, and it'll be a state like Wyoming. They'll have 2 electoral votes and they'll have no voice." And that's not true. They have 44% of the population. They'll have 24 electoral votes, which is almost not the biggest one, I don't think, but definitely in the top 5.
It's still pretty big. It wouldn't be as big as Florida, but it's still pretty big. 44% of 40
or so, right? I think Florida has 28, and I think New York has
22.
30. Does it? I'm 22. Okay.
Yeah,
But yeah, so
Texas is 30, so it's something smaller. It'd be smaller than New York and Florida,
mhm,
but pretty big, still in the top
yeah, definitely
half a
an
dozen or
influential
so.
voice and a swing vote. So that means
Hmm.
federal politicians will be traveling to this part of the state to get their vote. They're going to be traveling to Reading. They're going to be traveling to Modesto and Fresno and San Diego, places they don't typically go
Hmm.
on the West Coast because they need to vote. Now they travel to California sometimes. Where do they go? They go to the coastal counties to get donations from rich elite liberals, and then they go back to their campaign in Iowa or
Hmm.
Wisconsin. But in this situation, they're going to be coming to California not for the money so much, but for the votes, which will be good. So California, in that respect, not only
Yeah,
will have 24 electoral votes, but they'll also have the ability to influence who are the actual candidates running for office.
I think it's an interesting idea worth considering. I hope people consider it and think about it, think through the options. There's a lot of reasons to do something about the irreconcilable differences. So I see this as another possibility that people should be thinking about. Whether whether it's the best one or not, but supporting the idea of self-governance means it support people thinking about it. So
Yeah. We have to
yeah.
support freedom of association. Freedom of association, I think, is key.
Mhm.
And the founding fathers enshrined some principles into our Declaration of Independence, and I think that it's important for us to maintain those going forward.
So I'll pop your website back up again. So people that want to look into this a little further, it's CalExit. It's yescalifornia.org is the website. And we'll put this in the show notes on unsafespace.com. Takes a few days to show up there after the show. Do you want to say any other links or places to follow? Follow you, follow the movement?
Sure. Well, people can follow us on Twitter at Yes California. So we have yescalifornia.org website, and the Twitter handle is Yes California. We also have the Instagram account, which is at official CalExit. And we're also on Facebook as well at Yes California. So we have all the social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Yes California for all of them except Instagram, which is at official CalExit. And so they can go to these social media platforms to get information about our campaign. We use each platform for different purposes. So you can go to Twitter to read about short little snippets of information or comments or opinions. You can go to Facebook to get more like news updates, get the Instagram for our graphical representation of our campaign, different kind of videos and images. And our website contains kind of a mixture of all of it. So we're trying to reach out to everybody through all the different platforms, provide some information to them about our campaign. This is the new CalExit 3.0 campaign, and it's being run by the new Yes California.
Okay. All right. That's great. Is there any closing point you want to make, or something I didn't ask that you wanted to bring up?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that we talked about the new California campaign. I don't know if you wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, when we were talking about the various
Okay.
movements, yeah, if you want to spend a couple minutes on it, because you talk about the state of New California, and I was on a show, I was interviewed on a show about that. So this is a movement, it's a variation on it, where they start a state called New California that's spun off as part of California. You want to summarize that one?
Yeah, so I'm not a part of the campaign for New California, but as I understand it, they have, and this is why I bring it up because it's a very similar kind of map as to what we have here at CalExit 3.0, where they also divide the state along its ideological lines, where they have the Bay Area and some of the coastal counties, which would secede from the state of California. So it's very similar to CalExit 3.0 in that respect. The key difference between, as I understand, the new California campaign and CalExit 3.0 is that our campaign has those seceding counties not only secede from California, but also secede from the United States in order to save both California and the United States. And so that's the key difference. Although our maps are similar, they have 2 U.S. states at the end of the game, and we have one, and then a new country.
Mm-hmm.
And so I generally support the idea of the New California campaign. The only thing I disagree with them with is I think if we're going to go through all the trouble of having the state split up, why not go the extra step and get those left extreme counties out of the country so that we don't just save California, but we also save America.
So this one I was on a show in October about, and I had objected to this, or at least pointed out. I don't object to the idea of secession, I'm going to call it, but the way to do that constitutionally is the New California has to secede from the Union and form an independent country, and then it can petition Congress to join the United States. Otherwise, they're following the West Virginia model, which was illegal and it was unconstitutional. The only way that you can remain in the Union legally, constitutionally, and do that is to petition the government of the state to leave, and I wouldn't expect California to agree. But
yeah, I think
from what I heard, they're not even trying that. They just want to make a new state.
Yeah, I think that the fundamental logistics of how to achieve the campaign, no matter if it's CalExit or New California or Jefferson, all run into the similar problem of you're going to have Sacramento agree to it at some point in time or another. I mean, you can declare yourself, for example, the state of Jefferson, and you can declare that, but effectively you don't have the state of Jefferson. So at some point in time, no matter if you're doing Jefferson or CalExit or New California, you're going to have to get Sacramento to agree to it. I think that where our campaign benefits in that respect, and is different from the other two, is that we're getting Sacramento to be a part of the group that is seceding. So they're not losing anything. They're taking the parts that they care about, which is reflective in where they spend their money and where their voters are, and they're all going. So we're not saying, Sacramento has to agree to lose XYZ. No, Sacramento and XYZ go together, and they can do their own thing. So I think they'd be much more receptive because they would recognize that they would be free to do things that they want to do, but they don't quite have the political support to do it because they would have 3-1 Republicans in the new country, whereas now I think it's 2-1.
Okay, so if I'm gonna attempt to run them down, and I appreciate your listing these, so I can at least kind of wrap my head around this. So we have, I'll just say CalExit 3, which is what you were talking about, which is part of California. The politically left part splits off and forms a new country, and the remaining part stays in the United States as California. No change. That's right. Then there's the one we were just talking about, which is New California, which is a 51st state. Pretty hardcore conservative, it sounds like. They just form a new state, however they do it. The third one is Jefferson, which is a variation on that, but it's the northern and eastern section. So that's rural.
Northern box. Yeah.
Northern box. That's 3. Then CalExit 2, as you're calling, or CalExit without a number. That is the whole state secedes and becomes a progressive.
Yeah, so basically
but it's going to be mixed. So that I have one more. So that one, there's at least one more. Oh, I was going to list the Greater Idaho movement, where eastern part of Oregon leaves and some of the counties in northern California that border. Is it Calumet and a couple of the counties that go pretty far west in Oregon that have already voted to join Idaho border California. So it would be a contiguous Greater Idaho that could include some of California. I think I got 5. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's also the California National Party, which was, founded by.
Okay, let me write this down.
The people who created Yes California. So reach out to the California National Party. It's a political party. We founded that campaign back in 2015 with the goal of electing candidates to office to support the idea of independence.
Is that a full state secession movement? I don't even know about this one.
Yeah, they support the full state secession of California.
Okay. I'm gonna write it down. Thanks. So I got 6 total, I think.
Yeah, and I just to reiterate, the CalExit thing is it's it was Yes California, and Yes California created, for example, the California National Party, and they went in their direction. And then we had CalExit continue into CalExit 2. And now since CalExit 2, we've had some people who wanted to continue that path, so they've stayed this direction.
Yeah.
What we have is the actual organization itself has evolved and is now going back to its original root. So it's not that there are different.
Well, I counted them as two because there's two separate things. There's the CalExit 3, which is the split, and then CalExit 2. Although they don't use that name, they're using the name CalExit.
Yeah, I'm just trying to.
It'd be nice for branding purposes if all the names.
It's all the same people, but the group that comprised CalExit 2.0 has split.
Okay, so there's 6 total. That's interesting. Maybe there's more.
I would say Yes California, California National Party, the people that are doing the CalExit 2 still doing CalExit 2. New State of California, State of Jefferson, and then, as you mentioned, the Greater Idaho.
Okay. Did you get CalExit 3 in there? Maybe there's 7. Oh, you missed CalExit 3. There's 6. Okay, so there's 6. And so for people who support the Jeffersonian tradition of what's in the Declaration of Independence, the whole idea of people get to decide the form of government that they live under, that they don't live under a king. All these things are good to talk about and to think about. And they're all, in the end, they're all movements to deal with the problem of differences, some of which are irreconcilable. So I think it's all great that this is, even if there's not everybody agrees with how to do it, there's a lot of ideas. And the worse the problem gets, and we're watching Washington, D.C. and how they affect our lives, it hasn't gotten better since I've been paying attention, last 3-4 decades. It's getting worse. So I think something's going to happen eventually along the lines of one of these movements or some variation that we haven't thought of yet.
Yeah, I agree.
Probably more.
I think something's going to happen. I think that the atmosphere is going to change where all of a sudden it's going to become a mainstream idea. And I kind of think it's kind of like the biggest bandwagon in political history, because right now it's moving, but the people aren't jumping on it because they think it's not possible, or they think it's illegal, or it's unconstitutional, or this or that. But as soon as something happens where all of a sudden it breaks through that barrier, breaks through that glass ceiling, so to speak, people are going to jump on this idea so fast. It's going to be the biggest bandwagon in American political history. And people in every state are going to be organizing to have a national divorce or to partition their state into 1 or 2 different states along ideological lines. And I think that will then make rapid progress with respect to self-determination and freedom of association and national divorce. But it's got to break through one of those glass ceilings first. Otherwise, people are going to keep saying it's not legal, it's not constitutional, it's not possible, so on and so forth.
We covered that elephant in the beginning. So that's a great closing. So yeah, all this is good. So keep in mind, all this is good. We're talking about how to peacefully resolve differences. And we're talking about peaceful. You're not trying to start a war.
No, we're not starting a war. We are going to have a vote. And if the vote goes our way, we'll have the country of Pacifica. And if it doesn't, then the people have spoken.
I think we can do this without the president sending bombers to Sacramento. Right?
Biden does like to keep mentioning the fact that they have F-15s and that they'll use it against Americans.
It's one of the few places I agree with Biden is the right to keep and bear arms. So he's presented a powerful argument for why we need F-15s. So I agree. I would, anybody in Florida that wants to go in, I would love to upgrade my private pilot's license to get an F-15 rating. I think that would be fun, but I need help with gas and the landing fees, the hangar fees, really high. So I don't know what an annual costs on an F-15, but I'd be in. So, and Biden presented an argument. I forget exactly how he said it, but it's an interesting one. Maybe we'll have to discuss the right to keep.
For his right-wing friends who always talk about how the tree of liberty should be watered from time to time with the blood of patriots and blah, blah, blah. they're not going to be able to take on the government in today's day with an AR-15. They need an F-15, and so you're not going to. I disagree with that. I think that you don't need to have an F-15 to stand up for your liberty. And the Second Amendment exists specifically to protect the people from the government.
My view is neither President Trump or President Obama or who's ever next. I guess it's got to swing the other way. So I don't think it'd be DeSantis, but maybe. I don't think any of them would send bombers to destroy Sacramento, which is what Lincoln would do. Right? We're not in that era. We're not in that era anymore.
YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, live stories, live streams. There's no way that's going to happen. Not even with the idea of the bombers, not even tanks, not even soldiers, because how is the United States going to stand up on the world stage as the leader of democracy and freedom around the world, but they're running over their own people with tanks like in Tiananmen Square in China, when it's going to be all over the world in a minute? The whole world will be watching.
If the whatever part leaves, splits, however it happens, if they do what was done with the Declaration of Independence, which is announced to the world, here's why, and list the grievances, I think it would be politically disastrous for the federal government to do what was done in the 1850s. It would negate every foreign policy action of this century and all the last. That's what United States has been doing. I mean, there's been probably, I don't know the number, but I would say there's been hundreds of secessions.
Well, they've been
of people, and the United States sends massive amounts of force. I mean, Ukraine seceded from the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, like every war we've been involved with for the last 100 years, they would have to call themselves out as like, why does that not apply to Americans? The principle of the United States, even though I disagree with that, we could do a whole show on spending $1 trillion a year being the world's policeman. What they're doing is supporting the right of people to determine their own form of government, basically.
When it's convenient for the American government in their larger, more abstract geopolitical goals against Russia or China, yes, they support self-determination, but like you're saying, they wouldn't necessarily support it for their own people. Today we have social media that'd be all over the place. They wouldn't have a leg to stand on, and the people will be free.
So let's close it that these six, and I've also, we know a lot about the Texit movement, Daniel Miller, and that's like looking good. There's a nascent Flexit one that's been kind of batting the idea around for a long time. There's websites and Facebook pages and people into it. New Hampshire Exit is really going, like, maybe that'll be first. They're doing really well. I mean, they're voting a lot of what's been in the legislature the last couple of years. I mean, they had a secession referendum make it to the legislature floor to vote on. So New Hampshire's doing pretty well. None of these people are talking about going to war. Everybody's talking about peaceful secession. So let's leave it at there to make sure that's that second elephant in the room. That ain't what we're talking about.
Exactly.
All right. So I have one more thing I want to do is more of a just point out where people can go to find out show information. So go to unsafespace.com. You can find all the shows there. Lots of written content. There's a bunch of people writing articles. That's a fun one. That's the last one I wrote, The Myth of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But also you can go into the shows, and there'll be the show notes for this. That takes a few days to show up. But go into the recent video section. In a few days, this one will show up here, and you can click on that, and the links that we talked about and what Louis brought up will be there. And there's also, I'm supposed to do a shameless plug for the merch. So you can go into the merchandise, buy hats and stuff. The ones they're featuring now are the irreconcilable differences. There's the sheep and the porcupine. Splitting up. That actually worked out more appropriate than I knew was going to happen. So anyway, thanks for joining, and I hope we'll bring you back and talk to some more about this. We touched on a bunch of other subjects. I could see we could probably talk for an hour on the right to keep and bear arms. I already suspect that. So anyway, thanks for joining Unsafe Space.
Thanks for the invitation. Great talk.
This production was made possible through the generous support of our members. To join our community, visit unsafespace.com. Unsafe Space is an online publication for individualists interested in subverting authoritarianism and ushering in the next Enlightenment. For biting analysis and nourishing composition, or to sign up for our weekly news brief, The Abstract, visit unsafespace.com. Thanks for joining us today.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized for distribution on Apple devices. The following co-conspirators are hereby uninvited to Klaus Schwab's Winter Solstice Party. Please be advised that CBS News has paused activity on Unsafe Space while it continues to assess security. Central bank digital currency is a safe and secure way to protect you from Sam Bankman-Fried. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Science, scientific, and scientifically are registered trademarks of the World Economic Forum. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is misinformation. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.